Please welcome Dr. Eric Thomas Weber to Flyover. Where are
Yeah.
you from?
I let's see. That's not the easiest question to answer because I moved around some. I was born in Washington, D.C., so I don't have a U.S. state behind me,
Hmm.
but lived in New Jersey for many years, then in Georgia through high school, and then did college in Nashville and Tennessee at Vanderbilt, and then graduate school in Ohio and Southern Illinois before spending my first decade in my profession in Mississippi. And now I'm from Lexington, Kentucky. So long answer, but I tried to be quick.
Very good. Um, w- so, where was your first introduction to philosophy? Was it at college, or had you got into the subject before?
Well, I didn't know it to be an introduction to philosophy, but when you read the Federalist Papers at any point in your career, that's a pretty profound philosophical experience. When I was in high school, everybody would tell me that I should be a lawyer because I love to argue. Um, but it was coming to college that really showed me how much fun argument could really be,
Mhm.
right? And so, my first year of college, there was a course called Beyond Good and Evil, and it was about Nietzsche. And boy, that was an interesting and great experience for me. But it was the next semester when I read Plato that really solidified it for me. I enjoyed Nietzsche, but kind of it was pretty big picture stuff for someone who was only just being introduced to some of these ideas. Anyway, I think reading Plato's Meno really knocked my socks off. Reading Plato in general blew me away about just how relatable someone could be from 2,400 years ago, asking questions that I might ask today. It's so alive and salient still. That Plato's the one who hooked me.
Yeah, when I went to undergrad and started studying philosophy, I was completely of the mindset that I didn't want a bunch of old stuff. Like I wanted, current, contemporary stuff. And so, you know, you can't, you can't overlook like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. So, because when you're reading all of the later philosophy, the echoes of them are there. So,
Mhm.
that's how I was introduced to them is through those echoes. But I didn't actually seriously read Plato or Aristotle until I was in grad school, which I know is probably funny for many people, but
Well, a lot of people
uh,
are really interested in ethics and a lot of the very practical reasons why someone thinks about philosophy. And so you can do a lot of that without necessarily focusing on the ancients or something, right? And therefore, it makes sense that someone would take some courses in subject areas of interest before then finally getting around. Actually, it was a long time before I read Plato's Republic. You know what I mean? And people think of that as such a core and important text for Plato. But I had read some Plato, but it was the Republic that was the one that was one I read later than compared to other people. And it's just, when you get around to it, what happens is you see all the threads connect that you hadn't connected before. That kind of makes so much more sense all of a sudden. I think that's one of the things that's hard about, reading contemporary material because it's always, responding to something in the past. You know what I mean? It's always, connected. And so it's a lot harder, I think, to understand something when we go with contemporary tools. At the same time, understanding its importance and relevance today, of course, is much easier. So that's the hard part. Is at the same time, the two things are useful, of course. Attention to philosophical ideas today, as well as understanding where they come from.
I
But the
think
point isn't just a historical exercise, though. It's also how you can understand what it is your position is. Let's say you want to buck tradition. You can't do that well and meaningfully if you don't really know what tradition is, right? So it's a challenge, but it's worthwhile.
yeah, I remember as far as like reading more contemporary stuff and then learning the older stuff later. I think there's like a funny example of something that probably can't be avoided, right? Is like you don't always understand the concepts necessarily in the way that they're being presented. And I have no idea how many philosophy books I read, several, maybe in double digits. Uh, where I had heard a particular phrase and was completely misunderstanding it. And it was the phrase common sense. So
Hmm.
I understood common sense as it's used every day in American parlance, right? Like sort of like that, like street smarts almost, right? Or, like the intelligence of not being educated almost. But I didn't understand the way that it was used in classic philosophy. And it really when I realized what they were talking about, it completely upended what I thought I had understood about what I was reading.
Hmm.
Um, which what's your specialty within philosophy?
Well, my greatest interests have always been about moral and political philosophy, but those have aspects and areas of focus, right? And so the big thing I think philosophers tend to do is they very often try to ignore and forget about childhood. I don't know if it's because of misogyny and the history of thinking of things about children as involving women's work or what have you, but the tradition of social contract theory of thinking about kind of consent of the governed is that, I'm not going to hurt you so that you don't hurt me, all that kind of stuff. All of that is this idea about society based on adults coming together to agree about stuff so we have a better society. But you can mess people up early on by just, being unjust to them while they're young, right? And limiting their options in life and and so forth. And so I like to think about, the development of persons, which I think is one of the obvious place in which you can sort of try and oppress people is oppress them at their weakest when they're young, right? And so that's, I think, a terrible thing that to be watched for, and therefore the philosophy of education is of great importance to me. And it's not only about the young, of course, but that's where we tend to concentrate our energies and thoughts and ideas about education. Of course, education is and should be lifelong, but thinking about the philosophy of education, I think, is crucial because we make a lot in philosophy out of how people view the world and how people think about it. But we do all kinds of things which shape how those views come together, right? And therefore, it's vital to think about how that shaping happens, um, because you can clearly steer society on the basis of different ways of thinking about that.
Yeah, and so you ended up after school, you ended up teaching, and I remember how proud you were. I think sometimes people in our business can be a little afraid to show how excited they are about getting something, but I remember your social media post and everything like that when you got your job in Mississippi.
Hmm.
You were very proud of it, and you really went to work. Like I was impressed with your public presentation and writing, and you went down there, and I've lived in Mississippi. It's got some of the faults that most places can have, and they don't always like people who aren't from there telling them, what's what. But you really went in there and were part of like the flag issue. I
Oh,
saw
sure.
you started writing about that. So was that rewarding? It seemed like externally you were having a blast.
So, when I was at SIU, Southern Illinois University, people had told me all kinds of things about what was possible and not possible. For instance, that, oh, you can't possibly get a tenure track position straight out. You always move laterally or down, right, from an institution, all those kinds of things people will tell you. Um, you also hear about how people don't take philosophy seriously. And yet I was offered a really nice position in a department called Public Policy Leadership. You could just be the person who teaches service courses at the entry for undergraduates, but I wasn't treated that way. I was taken very seriously as a central part of the curriculum in terms of what I offered, like with everyone else. And when I presented at conferences and talked about ethics and so on in public policy, I got very great receptions from people. They listened seriously and sincerely to what I had to say, frankly, because it wasn't often talked about in those contexts, which is tragic and sad, which is ridiculous. And so I had very good receptions both inside and outside the academy. I had um, a program in a Research One university in the United States, in a place where there are lots of issues of interest to me to talk about regarding justice, especially in education and in public policy. I can't think of a better suited place for someone like me as a result, right, at the time. I will say that it was an undergraduate program, and so it was broader than where I am now. And now I'm in a program in educational policy studies and evaluation, so it's more focused in particular on education. But that's great for me because that was my direction and area of interest. I'm a scholar of John Dewey's work. His thought is in the air and the blood of colleges of ed everywhere. And so, but anyway, as a gig, absolutely, it was terrific. Yeah, well, I mean, what you want to work somewhere where your work is less relevant, less important, less useful? I mean, you go ahead, but I don't find that so meaningful. If you can go to another institution and help the 1% be more lucky in terms of their futures, or you can go to a state university where you open doors of opportunity to the rich and the poor, right? Like I had that chance to do, and had lots of great students do all kinds of incredible things. One of my students was Mitt Romney's body man. There's a whole page written about my student in the New York Times. A whole page. I don't know. I've got students all over Washington, D.C. When I go to Washington, D.C., I have to watch out about saying something about it because I'll have, you know, 60 invitations. And I'm like, I love you guys, but I can't possibly do. I had on one trip to Washington, D.C., I had two different former students offer me and give me tours of the White House. And they were two different tours of the White House that you can't get, by the way. So, yeah, I'm proud of that job. It was a great job. It was a great experience. I wrote about the flag, and I had, oh, I don't know, over 100 people tell me things like, "Oh, they'll never change that flag." And by the way, the state of Mississippi has a different flag than when I arrived there, right? The state of Mississippi used to hit kids in public schools, and actually they still do, but they have stopped hitting kids with disabilities. I'm an advocate against corporal punishment. When you speak up and you make an argument and you make, sometimes some things change. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm very proud of things I contributed there. Before I worked at the University of Mississippi, they did not have a committee on accessibility at the chancellor's level. They do now because of myself and a former student. I won't name her without her permission, but I'm proud of that. I'm proud that there's a chancellor's level standing committee on accessibility at the University of Mississippi. That was a service task that I advocated for. That is one of the most meaningful I think I contributed at that university. I feel really good about that. Things like that. People can be as off-putting as they want about their jobs and whatever. I don't know. I had a lot to be grateful for.
No,
So
it's great. I can imagine like that's a lot of pride. I haven't even come close to that. I've had, students give me like free coffee at Starbucks, which is kind of nice.
that's great. But you never know. Like 10 years from now, you might happen upon someone who says, Professor Outlaw, you may not remember me, but you asked me this question, 15 years ago, and here's what it did to my life. Like, you don't know, and you may not have that experience, but it could have been that happened to all kinds of people. You just, you don't get that side of things, but you don't do it for the little rewards. But it's kind of nice when they, share those
All,
with you,
all
right?
joking aside, I've had those emails, so those are
Yeah,
nice. That's the moment, right? Like that's great. Like
right.
it's good to know that you've touched people. So
Yeah,
that's good. So if I could ask you a question or two, if
sure.
there was somebody out there who hadn't hasn't started to study philosophy or has only studied very little of it, what do you think are good pieces, like a short read or a video or anything that you think would help people get into philosophy?
There are some great works of philosophy that are short and are really enjoyable. The big thing I would almost always recommend, however, is to encourage people to begin by exploring the philosophy regarding the things of interest to them, right? Almost always there's someone doing philosophical thinking about whatever it is you're interested in. If anyone who can see my picture, you know that I'm not a runner. But there are people who are runners. And if you want the philosophy of running, you can find the philosophy of running, the philosophy of sport. If you love cooking, there's fascinating questions to ask about, well, how should we think about our relationship to food and agriculture and animals and all that kind of stuff? There's fascinating stuff there. So I would almost always say, and this is because I'm a Deweyan philosopher, right? I'm a philosopher interested in John Dewey. Why? Because I thought when I read John Dewey that what he said about good education explained so beautifully why I loved the courses I loved and why I didn't like the courses I didn't like in my education. And it was at the center of his thinking that interest is an the invaluable source of energy in education. It is a self-moving spring, a resource and source. And so that's what I would say is to recommend almost always start with interests. And then those interests will guide you in certain directions. If you don't know what interests, you just kind of you've heard about philosophy, you enjoy it. It's a lovely book. It's not short, but it's fun, and it's Sophie's World by Justine Gardner. It's a international bestseller. And it's a terrific book that goes through the history of philosophy, and it's got a really clever kind of, literary kind of device I won't give away, but I'll encourage people to read that. And reading a chapter at a time of that is you can read a chapter of that, just enjoy it and stew on it. Maybe come back to it later, read another chapter. It's not like it's this, gripping tale where you have to, you have cliffhanger. You always have to know the next thing. It's a really wonderful book, and that one's good. As far as sort of other things, look, I again, interest, I think, again, is the most important component to be used for guidance. But I'll give you an example of how that worked for me. My daughter has a very complicated medical history. I don't control things that I wish I could control, and it very much helped my happiness to read and study Epictetus's handbook. It's called The Handbook by Epictetus, Epictetus, and he was one of the great Stoic philosophers, as I know you know, Chris. But Epictetus was a slave, and yet he grew to heights of great importance and influence, where he was advising an emperor, right? And anyway, the point is really about sort of learning how and why to prioritize those things that are in your control and to accept those things that aren't. This familiar line from Stoicism. Well, the handbook was very helpful for me to figure out how to be happy despite the medical problems that I couldn't control for my daughter. Similarly, I would say Buddhism, books by Thich Nhat Hanh, for instance, have been helpful about the eightfold path, whatever. You know, um, there are interesting similarities between Buddhism and Stoicism on how to sort of understand suffering and how to be happy despite it, kind of thing. So I think those two are examples of resources that I would point someone to if they've lost, if they've had suffering. But someone who's just in a joyful mood at the age of 18, I wouldn't send them to Epictetus as their starting point. Um, but maybe something like this actually, from Jean-Paul Sartre, the book Existentialism is a Humanism, is a bunch of mouthful kind of words. At the end of the day, there's a young man seeking advice about whether or not to go to war when his mama doesn't want him to, right? And thinking through the obligations you have and can feel about whether you owe it to your mother or owe it to your country is an interesting kind of debate. And the question is there really one correct answer to this? And I think that sort of question is a deep philosophical question, and people can feel very differently about this, right? And have all kinds of good reasons why. And it's very humbling because there's a genuine philosophical dilemma, and in how you think about such a thing can impact how you think about so many others. So I think that's a really fun, digestible, easily accessible text. And by the way, I used it to teach a class meeting with inmates in Parchman Prison in Mississippi, and they loved it. So if they could get on and love that and accessibly understand it and so forth and chomp at the bit to talk about it, you know, others can as well.
Well, that's great. Eric Weber, thank you
Such a
for joining
pleasure.
me today.
Thank you, Chris.